Players have the impression that the King's Gambit's a one-sided opening. White simply goes for an all-or-nothing outright attack against the f7 square. Well, the purpose of this tape is to prove that this need not be the case, and that the King's Gambit can be a positional as well as a tactical opening, and a very interesting opening at that. Here's a game from the recent Moscow Intel quick play between Morozovich and Anand, which brought the opening fully back into the limelight at Grandmaster level.
Первая партия.
Here we go then with teenager Alexander Morozovich's demolition of Anand with the King's Gambit. Anand accepted the pawn. He takes f4, and Morozovich played bishop c4, the bishop's gambit, which I'll be recommending later on the tape. Black went quickly into the main line, or what has become accepted as the main line. Knight f6, knight c3, and then black plays c6, trying to force through the move d5 with gain of time. Morozovich dropped back with the bishop, and indeed this was an approach which was recommended by Bobby Fischer long ago. But later in the tape you'll see that I recommend, instead of bishop b3, the move d4, an even more direct approach which I believe to be good for white. However, bishop b3 is not bad, as you'll see. Anand played d5, and white chopped the pawn off. E takes d5, c takes d5. And now the simple move, occupying the centre, d4, threatening bishop takes f4. Anand played bishop b4, pinning the knight on c3, and Morozovich just developed with the intention of castling knight f3. Instead of knight f3, knight ge2 has been recommended in some books, but Morozovich decides to play very directly. This is a quick play game after all. He decides to go for Anand's throat. Now both sides castle, and after Anand comes up with a slightly surprising move, bishop takes c3. I think the idea of this is that after b takes c3 he wanted to play queen c7. He gives white a backward pawn there on c3 to attack, and he shores up his own pawn on f4, but he can't really have believed that he could have kept the pawn on f4 for very long. I think the idea was to try and tie white's queen down, or white's queen's bishop. For instance, if white now played bishop d2, the bishop's tied down slightly. What Morozovich plays is excellent. He plays queen e1. Very good move this, simultaneously protecting the pawn and threatening to come out to the very aggressive square h4, where it not only attacks the f-pawn, but must contribute to a general assault against the h7 square. I would say black has serious problems already. Anand played knight c6, and after queen h4, knight e7. The knight is rushing across to either f5 or g6 to try and defend the black king. Well, all white's moves come very naturally in this game. Bishop takes f4, hitting the black queen, and the white pawn on c3 disappears from the board. Queen takes c3. Bishop d2, queen c7, and then knight e5. Well, what an excellent position for white this is. Look at that wonderful knight on e5. There are possibilities of an exchange sacrifice on f6, for instance with rook takes f6 at some point. And in general, black's position is very precarious on the king side. Anand tried to solve his problems by pushing the white queen around with knight f5, but this can only be a temporary solution because white's attack is persisting on the king side after queen f4. Then came bishop e6, and Anand had to face the power of white's queen's bishop coming out to b4, hitting the rook on f8. Another black piece now left the king side, rook fc8. So Morozovich probably felt it was now time to begin the decisive attack. He played g4, and then played knight d6, slightly insecure square for the knight, and then came rook a e1, and then knight f e4. c4 by white, undermining the position of the black knight on e4, and then grab the pawn, d takes c4. Bishop c2. At one stroke, white simultaneously attacks the knight, and if the knight moves, as it did, knight goes back to f6, then look at that wonderful diagonal for the bishop on c2, all the way down to h7. Very difficult for black to counter the effect of that bishop. g5. Well, black's position's getting a bit desperate. Knight h5, hitting the white queen, and the queen just dropped back to f3. Unremarkable move, but very strong nevertheless. Now black plays g6. He's trying to block white out on the light squares. Morozevich smashed his way through. Knight takes g6. Stunning move that. A stunning move. H takes g6. And then another stunning move. Bishop takes g6. A very violent assault in progress against the black king here. Difficult for black to refuse the sacrifices, so f takes g6, and now rook takes e6. Well, you can see the problem for black. Look at his rooks. Neither of them doing anything to contribute to the defence on the king side. More or less, black is just defending with his queen, and the knight on h5 against white's two rooks, queen, and even the bishop is joining in on b4. Queen f7, trying desperately to hold things up. Of course, Morozevich did not want the queens off, so he played queen d5, and then knight f5. Another brilliant sacrifice finished the game. Rook takes f5. And at this stage, Anand had had enough. Because if g takes f5, then g6 just wins. When the black queen moves, white will land a violent discovered check. And if black captures with the queen on f5, then rook takes g6 check, wins all black's pieces. So an absolutely brilliant game by Morozevich. Now obviously the most critical line of the King's Gambit is the acceptance of the Gambit, that is with 2 e takes f4. And on this video I'm going to recommend that white plays the Bishop's Gambit with 3 bishop c4. This is an aggressive move pointing at f7. It restricts black from playing the move, or is supposed to restrict black from playing the move d7, d5. And the move was a favourite of Bobby Fischer and David Bronstein, amongst others. The first variation we're going to look at is where black plays 3 d5, a move seemingly rendered impossible by bishop c4. Now the point of 3 d5 is that if white now plays bishop takes d5, black intends knight f6, with rapid development and a capture on d5 to come. I believe this is a rather cooperative way for white to play, and we should be looking for other moves. Accordingly, I propose that after 3 d5, white should play 4 e takes d5, an unusual move and a favourite of David Bronstein, that great chess innovator. The main advantage of this move is that it is very unusual. In fact, there are hardly any master examples, apart from a couple of Bronstein games, where the move was played. We'll see now the game Bronstein-Cheskovsky, USSR 1978, where white won excellently with e takes d5. Well, now black played the move you'd expect, knight f6. The alternative to knight f6 is the rather obvious check on h4 with queen h4 check. You'll be seeing this move crop up quite often in the video, and I hope to convince you that it's not a very dangerous idea. White should almost always respond king f1. In fact, there's hardly any book analysis on this position, because of course white usually would play bishop takes d5. So I propose to give you some original analysis of my own. Let's suppose black plays bishop d6 here. Well, I believe that white should reject the obvious knight f3 in favour of knight c3. You'll see why in a moment. Black tries to get castled with knight e7, and now I believe that knight e4 is the key move, threatening knight takes bishop, gaining the two bishops, and with the plan of bishop b3 and c4. White will gain time with knight f3 only as and when appropriate. For instance, after knight e4, let's assume black castles. I'm going to play the move d4 here. Then knight d7, knight takes d6, c takes d6, and now bishop b3 with the intention of c4 and then knight f3. I believe that if you follow this plan, and in particular you aim to exchange white's knight on b1 for the bishop on d6, then white gains a superior position against queen h4 check, almost by force. Now back to the game Bronstein-Cheshkovsky. You'll remember that white has just played e takes d5. Instead of queen h4 check, black played knight f6. White played knight c3, reinforcing the pawn on d5. And now black played c6. Replacing this move for a moment, we'll give black the move bishop d6. After that, white should play queen e2 check. Now this is a rather awkward check for black to meet. If he plays queen e7, then I think white is more than happy to exchange queens here. Queen takes queen, and if bishop takes queen, then simply d4. Here white has a clear advantage. He threatens to regain his pawn with bishop takes f4. If bishop d6, then white plays knight b5. Finally, if g5, which is a very loosening pawn move, then I think white simply plays h4, smashing up black's kingside pawns. In all these lines, due to the pawn on d5 having a cramping effect on black's position, white retains the advantage. In fact, a clear advantage. Right, back to the move c6. Bronstein played 6d4, and black played c takes d5. There is an alternative here. Knight takes d5, after which Bronstein offers the following analysis. Again, white will play queen e2 check, bishop e7, knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes d7 check, knight takes d7, and now a very interesting move, knight h3. Castles by black, and simply castles by white. Bronstein's idea is that if white is allowed to capture the pawn on f4 with his knight, then the pawn on d5 remains permanently weak, while at the same time white can reinforce his own pawn on d4 with the move c3. White retains superior prospects in this line because of the weakness of the pawn on d5. So, going further, and Bronstein analyses this variation in some depth. Black now plays bishop f6, white plays c3, and then Bronstein gives g5. Well, as we've said, this shouldn't really seem a surprising move, given that white is about to play knight takes f4 and exploit the position of the pawn on d5. And to that end, g5 tries to hold white up and maintain the pawn at f4. But of course, it's a risky weakening of the king position. So, 14 queen f3, attacking the d pawn. Bronstein's analysis goes knight b6, and then g3. White must break up black's bridgehead at f4. Queen d7. He gives queen h5. And now black's in a quandary. He's threatened with knight takes g5. And also g takes f4. In both cases opening up the king position. Bronstein gives a few more moves, not really critical, but you can see the basic outline of things. White is smashing up black's king position, g5 hasn't worked very well, and white has a clear advantage against black's weakened king. Coming back to the position after 6 d4, Cheskovsky played c takes d5. And now Bronstein gave the check, bishop b5 check. Black played knight c6, and white played bishop takes f4. Then came bishop d6, challenging white's bishop, and Bronstein played knight ge2. Interesting move this, doesn't crop up much in the King's Gambit. Normally you'd expect to see that knight on f3. But here, white reinforces the bishop on f4, and after castles, keeps the f-file open. So it is a very sensible move here. Black castled, and white castled too. Cheskovsky played simply, bishop takes f4. And Bronstein took with the rook. Cheskovsky played bishop g4, white played queen d2, and Cheskovsky hastened to remove a potential attacking piece. Bishop takes e2. Bishop takes e2, and black played queen b6. White played rook d1, reinforcing the d-pawn, setting up the threat of rook takes f6. And Cheskovsky played rook a d8, defending against the threat of rook takes f6 for one more move, because now the d-pawn on d5 is protected by the rook. Bishop d3. And black played knight e7. Bronstein played h3, and Cheskovsky played knight g6. Rook f2, and black played rook fe8. Now in this position, I believe white has some sort of advantage. Difficult to quantify exactly how great that advantage is, but the fact is that black's pawn on d5 is weak, and will remain so, and white has attacking chances against the black king, again connected with this move rook takes f6 at the right moment. It's difficult for black to find counterplay here. In fact, that is his main problem. He has no counterplay. He's just got to sit and wait for white to do something. So, to summarise. In this section, black plays d5. And then I recommend not bishop takes pawn, but pawn takes pawn. Here white hopes that the extra central pawn will cramp black's position, and his overall plan at some point is to play bishop b3 and c4, if allowed. Now a good black player won't allow you to do that, so most of the time you're going to have to reinforce this pawn with knight c3. You saw in the Bronstein-Cheskovsky game that white was quite happy to allow black to try and destroy the pawn, or even to replace the pawn on d5 with a pawn of his own. For instance, you'll recall Cheskovsky played c6 and c takes d5. But black's problem stemmed from the better white pawn structure resulting from this capture. The fact that the d5 pawn is isolated and weak, and when white arranges to capture the pawn on f4, he not only ends up with an attack along the open f-file, but with a potentially better ending. I don't believe 3d5 should give black anything other than problems, as long as white remembers to play pawn takes pawn, and follow it up, roughly, along the lines of what Bronstein did.